The village lost power, but not before someone lost their life. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Drop a comment with your location. I love seeing where our mystery crew gathers. You make every mystery brighter with your words. Here we go. The little village of Tillingham Green was the sort of place where nothing truly dreadful ever happened. It was a neat cluster of gabled cottages and manicured lawns nestled among the rolling hills of Devonshire, where the greatest scandal in living memory had been Mrs. Pembroke's Christmas sherry trifle, dropped quite disastrously into the vicar's lap. But on a damp April evening, as the church bells tolled 7 and a fine mist curled around the hedgerows, something far more serious than trifle was about to disrupt the village's quiet charm. The occasion was a modest, but much anticipated, candlelight recital in the parish hall, hosted by none other than Mr. Ephraim Cobb, Tillingham Green's resident candlestick maker and something of a local curiosity. With his snow-white hair tied back in a short ponytail, cravat always impeccably knotted, and an air of theatrical melancholy, Mr. Cobb had long charmed the ladies of the Women's Institute and unnerved their husbands in equal measure. His handmade candles, dripped in waxed silence by hand in the back of his Tudor-era cottage, were famed for their scent, clarity, and eerie flicker. Tonight's performance featured local violinist Dora Lacey playing Bach by candlelight, with Mr. Cobb providing an artistic flourish, rows of his beeswax tapers casting golden glows across the hall. He stood at the back of the room, arms folded behind him, basking in the flickering ambience like a man who had conjured it from some bygone century. Miss Marple was there, of course, quietly seated near the rear on a stiff wooden chair, her gloved hands folded neatly in her lap, blue eyes quietly alert beneath the brim of a dove-grey hat. She had no particular fondness for Mr. Cobb, whom she once referred to, only in confidence to her close friend Mrs. Bantry, as a man who likes to be admired too much for a trade that requires silence. Still, the candles were lovely, the music soothing, and Tillingham Green offered a serenity not found in St. Mary Mead during daffodil season. It was just past the midpoint of a haunting adagio when the first scream shattered the peace. At first, it seemed an odd, misplaced note, a high-pitched sound not belonging to the violin. But it was followed by a crash, then the sudden, unmistakable clatter of falling metal as one of the ornate brass candelabras toppled to the floor with a heavy clang. A woman cried out, and the lights, true electric ones tucked behind wooden sconces, flickered and cut out entirely. For several heartbeats the room was plunged into a darkness, broken only by a few stubborn candle flames and the uneasy murmur of confused villagers. Someone fumbled for the switches, and when the lights snapped back on moments later, all attention turned to the front of the hall, where Dora Lacey stood frozen, violin in hand, her face a mask of horror. Lying beside the dais, half slumped against the panelled wall, was the unmistakable figure of Mr. Ephraim Cobb. A crimson trail marred the parquet floor, creeping slowly from beneath his waistcoat. His eyes, wide and glassy, stared blankly at the ceiling. One hand reached toward the nearest candelabra, his own creation, its base now twisted and stained dark with blood. Gasps rippled through the gathering. Miss Marple did not rise from her seat. She remained still, watching the others rush forward. She had already noted 3 things: the slight scent of burnt lavender, the peculiar direction in which Mr. Cobb's body had fallen, and the expression on Dora Lacey's face. Not one of shock alone, but something else, a glimmer of guilt. Or was it grief? The village of Tillingham Green, once so content with its teas and hymnals, would soon discover that candlelight does not merely soften shadows, it also conceals sins. And no one knew better than Miss Marple that where there is light, there is also darkness. The morning after the candlelight recital dawned with a kind of cautious quiet, as if the village itself were holding its breath. Tillingham Green was not a place accustomed to death, let alone violent death, and certainly not at the hands of one of their own. Murder, it was whispered now, though not yet confirmed, was something that happened in cities, in newspapers, to people with unfamiliar names. Not here. Not to someone like Mr. Ephraim Cobb. By mid-morning, the shock had begun to settle into a sort of communal tension. The postmistress, Mrs. Clarebrook, was already giving contradictory accounts of the incident to anyone who dared collect their letters. "They say it was the violin string," she murmured conspiratorially to Mr. Halberton, the retired schoolmaster. "Garroted, like in those books, very clean, very professional. A jealousy thing, I expect. Those musicians are passionate types." Miss Marple, who had come into the village square ostensibly to buy lavender soap, overheard this while fingering a rack of potholders at the general store. She made no comment, but a slight twitch at the corner of her mouth betrayed her amusement. Garroted indeed. She had seen the body, or at least enough of it to know the blow had not been clean nor professional. It had been clumsy, panicked even, and there had been far too much blood for a calculated execution. Still, it was interesting that the violin string theory had taken root so quickly. She made a mental note of it. Outside the constable's cottage, a small knot of villagers had gathered to speculate. The local constable, a square-jawed young man named Arthur Craig, was doing his best to maintain order, though it was clear from his pinched expression that the situation was well out of his depth. "I've given statements to the chief inspector from Exeter," he said, lifting his chin. "He's on his way down, shouldn't be long. Until then, I'd advise everyone to go about their business." But villagers do not easily return to routine when a murder has occurred in their midst, especially not when the murder has taken place in such close company. Nearly everyone in the hall the night before had known Mr. Cobb, or at least thought they did, and each had noticed something, or believed they had. Suspicion flickered from face to face like candlelight in a draughty room. At the vicarage, Reverend Felton was visibly distressed. He had presided over last evening's recital with gentle encouragement and was now anxiously reviewing the evening in his mind for signs he might have missed. Arguments, raised voices, strange behavior. His wife, a brisk and practical woman of 50, reminded him that there was no use wringing hands until the authorities had made their inquiries. At the front window of the Sweet Peony, the village tea shop, Mrs. Finch arranged her floral napkins, with trembling fingers while whispering to her assistant, Ivy, that Mr. Cobb had once been engaged to Dora Lacey's aunt long ago, and that perhaps some old family quarrel had rekindled. "You know how artists are," she said, voice low. "They brood over slights for decades." Miss Marple, however, had heard nothing from Dora Lacey. This was unusual. By late afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the edge of the village, where Dora lived alone in a charming ivy-covered cottage with a sloped roof and a weathered gate that squeaked when opened. She had inherited it from her great-aunt Agatha, an enthusiastic gardener but an indifferent housekeeper, and Dora had done little to change either legacy. The front garden was wild and lovely, with forget-me-nots peeking through tangles of sage, and the house itself smelled faintly of dust and roses. Dora opened the door at once, pale and visibly shaken. Her normally sleek blonde hair was caught up hastily in a clip, and there was a small smudge of candle soot on her sleeve. "Miss Marple?" she said, almost as if relieved. "Please, come in. I've been expecting someone." "Someone official?" Miss Marple asked, following her into a sitting room that looked as though it had recently been cleaned in haste. Dora gave a nervous laugh. "Well, I suppose I thought there'd be questions. About last night?" "There will be," Miss Marple said gently, settling into an armchair with a faint creak. "But I thought perhaps you could use a cup of tea before they arrive." Gratefully, Dora fetched the tray. Her hands shook slightly as she poured. "I suppose you saw him? Saw Mr. Cobb?" she asked, her voice catching. "Yes," said Miss Marple, watching the younger woman closely. "A dreadful shock for you. You were playing so beautifully. And then—" Dora nodded quickly, her eyes filling. "It was so sudden. I turned and he was just there, on the floor. Bleeding." She paused, gripping her teacup. "It's all anyone is talking about. They think I know something. I don't. I really don't." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "You were very fond of Mr. Cobb, weren't you?" Dora hesitated. "He was kind to me, encouraging, a little odd, perhaps, very intense at times. But I never imagined, who would want to kill him?" "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "though people are not always killed for what they've done. Sometimes it's for what they know, or what they might do." Dora blinked. "I don't understand." "You will," Miss Marple said, not unkindly. "In time." That evening the Chief Inspector arrived from Exeter. Inspector Garraway was a large, slow-moving man with a deeply lined face and a voice like gravel dragged over stone. He interviewed the guests one by one, but in the manner of one ticking names off a list, not truly believing anyone in the parish hall was capable of such violence. "The victim's head wound is consistent with blunt force trauma," he said the next day, summarizing to Constable Craig as they stood near the dais in the now silent hall. "Candelabra seems the likeliest weapon. Heavy base, bloodied. We'll send it for testing, though I doubt it'll tell us more than we already know." Miss Marple was nearby, studying a wax trail that had dried along the floorboards near the dais. She stooped to examine it with the care one might give to an injured bird. "It's interesting," she murmured, "that the candles were all lit before the guests arrived, but this one," she pointed to a stubbed, cold taper, "was never burned at all. Yet it's been moved." Garraway looked at her blankly. "Moved?" "Yes," she said. "The dust pattern is broken and there's a faint mark where wax dripped and dried on the floor, but no matching candle above it. Almost as if someone switched it, or took it," the inspector grunted non-committally. "We'll note it, but I doubt candle arrangements had much to do with murder." Miss Marple straightened slowly. "Oh, but in my experience," she said, "murders often begin with very small things, especially when they appear decorative." She left them there, her steps soft on the wooden floor, while behind her the light from the windows fell across the dais and the candelabras, now dark and unlit. Outside, the mist had returned, curling like smoke through the trees. The village, so lovely in the light, was slowly being cloaked once more. Something had been snuffed out in Tillingham Green, not only a life, but a certainty. And Miss Marple, without appearing to pry, had begun to see the shape of the truth hidden beneath the wax and shadows. And there were still secrets to unearth, many of them. It was a curious thing, Miss Marple reflected, how a village could carry on even in the wake of murder. By the following morning, washing still hung on the lines like tired flags of a defeated army. Milk bottles clinked on doorsteps. Children were shepherded to school with quiet warnings not to speak of grown-up matters. But beneath the ordinary, rhythms of Tillingham Green pulsed something uneasy, a tension that lingered in conversations and narrowed glances. No one said it aloud, but everyone was asking the same question. Who among us is capable of killing? Miss Marple was having tea that day with Mrs. Edith Bantry, an old friend from St. Mary Mead, who had taken up temporary residence in Tillingham Green while her niece recovered from a minor operation. They sat in the sunlit drawing-room of the Bantry cottage, a tray of scones between them, the air fragrant with jam and daffodils. "I've always said candlestick makers are peculiar sorts," Edith declared, dabbing crumbs from her mouth. "Something about all that solitude and wax. You remember Mr. Withers from Little Dinnington? Made candles for every wedding and funeral in 3 counties, and was arrested for pinching brooches off the dead. Terribly polite man, always had shortbread. Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, well, politeness is not incompatible with vice. Quite the opposite sometimes." "What do you make of it all?" Edith asked, leaning forward. "They're saying Dora Lacey had a row with Mr. Cobb just last week. Something about money or a portrait." "I'd heard something similar," Miss Marple replied, reaching for a second scone. "Though there are always quarrels in villages, not all end in murder. Besides, if Dora had killed him, it would have been cleaner." "Cleaner? Neater? Less panic. What happened on that stage was desperate, uncontrolled. Someone lost their nerve." Edith looked at her with a mixture of admiration and dread. "You do give me chills when you talk like that." Miss Marple merely sipped her tea. "The truth is, my dear, people often kill not because they plan to, but because they feel cornered. And in a small village like this, it's very easy to feel trapped." Later that afternoon, a small notice appeared on the post office board announcing that Ephraim Cobb's shop and home would remain closed, pending inquiry by the proper authorities. But the sign did little to deter curiosity. By dusk, half the village had walked by the shuttered shop at least once, pausing to glance at the drawn curtains and locked door, as if expecting the house to whisper its secrets. It was Ivy Partridge, Mrs. Finch's young assistant at the tea shop, who gave Miss Marple her next thread to tug. "I shouldn't say anything," Ivy whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "But Mr. Cobb had a visitor last week. A lady, not from the village, came in a motor car and stayed almost an hour. I saw them arguing." "Arguing?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her eyes sharpened. "Oh, yes. I was sweeping out back and heard raised voices. Her accent wasn't local. Posh, you know. She called him a liar and something about ruining lives. Then she left in a huff." "And Mr. Cobb?" He looked shaken. "Shut the shop early that day. I remember because Mrs. Piggott came by for her candle order and was furious to find the place locked." Miss Marple thanked her and continued on her way, pausing only to peer down the side street that led to Mr. Cobb's now silent cottage. An unfamiliar woman, angry, accusing. It didn't quite fit into the picture the village had drawn of Ephraim Cobb, eccentric, perhaps vain, but ultimately harmless. Unless, of course, Mr. Cobb had not been quite the man they believed him to be. The next day brought the arrival of a letter, delivered in an unremarkable brown envelope addressed in a careful, slanted hand to Miss Marple herself. No return address. She opened it over breakfast, her toast growing cold as she read the short note. "There are things about Mr. Cobb that should remain buried. Some secrets do not belong in the light. For your own safety, let sleeping wax lie." There was no signature. Miss Marple read it twice, then carefully folded the paper and slid it back into the envelope. She said nothing to her housekeeper, only requested that the fire be stoked, and that she would take a walk into the village a bit later. By the time she arrived at the constable's cottage, Inspector Garraway was already seated inside, hunched over a cup of tea, and looking more grim than usual. "We've got a situation," he said, waving her into a chair. "Dora Lacey attempted to leave the village last night. had her suitcase packed and everything, caught her just as she was getting into the carrier's van to catch the early train from Axminster. Did she give a reason? Said she needed air. That it was all too much. Thought she'd visit a cousin in Leamington Spa, but it's suspicious timing, wouldn't you say? Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. She was watching a fly buzzing against the window pane, trapped by the light it mistook for freedom. "I think," she said at last, "that Dora is frightened, but not of justice." Garraway raised a brow. "Of what, then?" "Of what Mr. Cobb knew, or perhaps what he threatened to reveal." The inspector snorted. "Seems Cobb was more connected than we thought. We've had word from Exeter. Cobb had investments, not all of them clean. A few names have come up that might explain why someone would want to silence him." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And what of the lady in the motor car?" Garraway frowned. "We're still trying to trace her. No one seems to have caught the plate." "Oh," Miss Marple said mildly. "But she left a clue nonetheless." She pulled from her handbag a tiny scrap of embossed card, barely larger than a postage stamp, bearing the faint gold initials E.V. "I found it near the dais," she said, "beneath the corner of the piano rug. Someone dropped it in haste. And Mr. Cobb, I think, meant to retrieve it. His hand was reaching toward that very spot." Garraway turned it over in his fingers. "Initials. Could be anyone." "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "But not just anyone would attend a village recital in designer heels and forget to collect her calling card. This woman was used to being obeyed and being feared." She stood, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. "There's more to this, Inspector. The candle was merely the beginning. The real wick runs deeper." As she stepped out into the cool spring air, Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the church tower, the fields beyond, and the growing shadows cast by late afternoon. Somewhere in Tillingham Green, the truth flickered, just out of reach, like a flame threatening to gutter out. She would need to move carefully. Secrets were beginning to rise from the wax, and someone in the village wanted them to stay buried. But Miss Marple had never been one to leave a candle unlit. The air was crisp the next morning, and the village lay wrapped in a chill mist that hung low over the hedgerows like breath held too long. Birds chirped with hesitant optimism, unaware that beneath the quiet surface of Tillingham Green, threads of tension were tightening by the hour. Miss Marple rose early, her mind already at work, long before her hands reached for the kettle. She had slept little, turning the puzzle over in her thoughts through the darkest hours of the night. Mr. Cobb, the outsider with polished manners and a private trade, had lived among the villagers for nearly a decade, yet it was becoming increasingly clear that they had never truly known him. The mysterious woman visitor, the threatening note, the curious behavior of Dora Lacey, it all pointed to a deeper truth that lay just beneath the waxy surface of village civility. By mid-morning, she was seated in her usual place near the window of the Sweet Peony, sipping a tepid cup of tea and observing the foot traffic outside with an eye so discreet it could easily be mistaken for idle daydreaming. The shop buzzed with talk of Cobb's funeral arrangements, pending official inquiries, everyone repeated, as if quoting scripture, and speculation now included a theory involving smuggled antiques and another about a secret marriage. But Miss Marple was not interested in gossip. She was waiting, and precisely at 10:30, the motor car returned. It was sleek and black with a long hood and a faint purr that suggested wealth rather than flamboyance. It turned into the square without hesitation and came to a stop outside the boarded-up candlemaker's cottage. The driver, A woman stepped out. Miss Marple studied her carefully. Tall, with a cream coat belted tightly at the waist, gloves of pale suede, and a dark green hat pinned at just the right tilt, she carried herself with the self-possession of someone used to drawing attention and managing it. Her age was difficult to place, perhaps 45, but her bearing belonged to a woman who had known status and had no intention of surrendering it. Without glancing left or right, she walked straight to the front door of Mr. Cobb's home and knocked. The knock went unanswered. Miss Marple allowed herself the briefest of smiles. Cobb's cottage was sealed by order of the chief inspector. The woman would find no answers within those walls, but her presence, her return, was answer enough. Rising from her seat, Miss Marple left the tea shop and approached the woman with the same quiet certainty as someone retrieving an umbrella they'd left behind. "Good morning," she said pleasantly. "You must forgive me for the intrusion, but I don't believe we've been introduced." The woman turned, her expression instantly guarded. "I'm sorry, are you?" "Jane Marple," she said simply, offering her hand. "Just a friend of the late Mr. Cobb, as are many in the village." The woman took the hand briefly. "Elaine Venn. I knew Mr. Cobb some time ago. I was surprised to hear what happened." "Surprised or concerned?" Miss Marple asked, her tone light but watchful. Elaine's eyes flickered. "I suppose both." "Were you close to Mr. Cobb?" Elaine hesitated. "We were business associates. Years ago. I hadn't seen him in some time." "Oh, yet you were here last week, arguing, according to Miss Partridge from the tea shop?" Elaine stiffened. She must be mistaken. "I imagine one doesn't forget a woman in such impeccable heels," Miss Marple said gently. "Nor such a voice. You see, Mr. Cobb was a man who kept his acquaintances very quiet. I suspect that suited you both. Until something changed." Elaine's lips pressed together. For a moment it seemed she might walk away, but instead she drew a breath and glanced around to make sure no one was too near. "I came because he sent for me," she said finally. "A letter. He said he had something to discuss, something that couldn't be written." "And what was that, may I ask?" Elaine looked down at her gloves. "He threatened to reveal something about our past. I thought it was a bluff, but I came anyway in case it wasn't." Miss Marple waited. Elaine's voice dropped lower. "Years ago we were involved in a scheme. Legal, technically, but not entirely ethical. Ephraim made a great deal of money, more than I did. There were others involved, one in particular, man named Charles Lansing, dangerous sort. If Ephraim intended to stir up the past, it could ruin lives. Mine included." "Did he threaten you?" "Not in so many words. But he implied that if I didn't agree to meet him, he might go to the press. Or worse." Miss Marple's expression remained serene. "And did you kill him to protect yourself?" Elaine flinched, recoiling slightly. "Of course not. I left that night and haven't spoken to him since." Miss Marple inclined her head, as if accepting the answer, for now. "I imagine the inspector will want to speak with you," she said. "Best not to leave again without informing someone. It's very easy to become a suspect when one flees." Elaine nodded curtly and stepped away. She climbed into the car and started the engine, her jaw set. Miss Marple watched her go, the wheels crunching softly on gravel. That afternoon she paid another visit, this time to Dora Lacey, who opened the door looking even paler than before. "You've had a visitor," Miss Marple said without preamble. "Elaine Venn? She and Mr. Cobb had history?" Dora's hands trembled. "I didn't know her name."
only that she came to see him. He told me afterward, said she might try something foolish. I didn't ask what he meant, but you were worried. Yes, he'd become
obsessed with something lately. Talked of unfinished business. Of people who needed to pay for old sins. It frightened me, Miss Marple nodded. And he had no family? No, none he ever spoke of. Miss Marple stood. One last question.
My dear, did Mr. Cobb ever speak to you about a will? Dora's brow furrowed. A will? No, why? Because people with secrets, Miss Marple said softly, sometimes try to tidy up their affairs before the truth comes out.
That evening, Inspector Garraway received confirmation that Cobb had, in fact, amended his will just 3 days before the murder. The primary beneficiary, Dora Lacey. Miss Marple sat by the fire, a shawl over her knees, a fresh letter resting in her lap. She had received it late that evening, slipped through the door without a sound. You were warned. Let it go. There are still things in the dark you don't understand. No signature. No return address. But Miss Marple had faced worse threats than anonymous notes, and she had no intention of stopping. Because now she knew the light was beginning to shine in precisely the right places. The following morning brought with it a brisk wind that tossed the daffodils along Church Lane and rustled the notice board outside the post office until its tacks groaned in protest. Tillingham Green was stirring early, farm hands marching off with pails, the baker's lad weaving through the lanes with a basket of fresh bloomers, and yet, amid the ordinary, there remained that unmistakable tension. Murder, like smoke, lingered. Long after the fire had been put out, Miss Marple found herself summoned to the vicarage that morning. Reverend Felton, though a mild and compassionate man by nature, was looking unusually flustered as he met her at the door. "My dear Miss Marple, thank you for coming," he said, ushering her in. "I have something rather unsettling to show you." In the drawing-room, upon a silver salver that usually bore Eccles cakes or hymn sheets, lay a singed piece of parchment. It had clearly been burned at the edges and still carried the faint smell of smoke. Miss Marple peered at it closely. Though much had been destroyed, a few lines of text remained. "To whom it may concern, I, Ephraim Cobb, being of sound mind, do hereby a will, or rather the remains of one." Where did this
come from? She asked calmly, though her mind had already sprung into motion.
"The groundskeeper, Henry Blake, found it this morning in the ashes behind the church hall," said the vicar. "He was raking the old bonfire pit, thought it was rubbish until he saw the handwriting, brought it straight to me. I've no idea."
"How it got there? Convenient, isn't it?" Miss Marple murmured.
"That someone would go to the trouble of destroying a will, and do so on consecrated ground." The vicar cleared his throat uncomfortably. "You think it's connected, then?" "I think it's very likely that Mr. Cobb had more than one
version of his will," she said. "The one discovered by the inspector, naming Dora Lacey, may not be the only document. If this was an earlier version or a later one, someone clearly wanted it gone."
Later that day, Inspector Garraway confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion. The handwriting on the burned document matched Cobb's, and the wording aligned with legal phrasing used in standard wills. Unfortunately, too little of it remained intact. "To determine the beneficiary, someone's tampering," the inspector muttered. "Hiding something, but who?" Miss Marple, sitting across from him in his office with her knitting needles quietly clicking, didn't answer directly. "Do you know much of Charles Lansing?" she asked instead. Garraway looked up sharply. "Name came up in Cobb's financials. He's under investigation, fraud, embezzlement, that sort of thing. What about him?" "I believe Mr. Cobb feared Lansing, perhaps enough to reconsider where his money might go should something happen to him. You see, people make wills not only to reward affection, but to protect the vulnerable. You think Cobb was protecting someone? I think, Miss Marple said, that the answer may lie not in what Cobb left behind, but in what he tried to keep from being found. That afternoon, Constable Craig made a discovery of his own. While taking a routine look through the cottage's outbuildings, he stumbled upon a narrow wooden trunk tucked behind a stack of old wax moulds. It was locked, but the lock had been recently tampered with, scratched around the edges as though someone had tried and failed to force it open. With the inspector's approval, it was pried loose. Inside were letters, dozens of them yellowing with age but carefully tied in bundles. Atop them sat a smaller envelope marked in Cobb's bold, angular hand, "To be delivered upon my death." It was addressed to Miss Marple. The inspector handed it over without hesitation, his gruff expression tinged with something like relief. "He wanted you involved," he said simply. "Seems you're already ahead of us." Miss Marple opened the letter slowly, methodically, her eyes scanning the lines with increasing gravity. "If you are reading this, then I am dead. I believe someone means to stop what I am about to do. I have made mistakes in my life, Miss Marple. One of them was trusting Charles Lansing. Another was waiting too long to make them right. The woman Elaine Venn knows much, but not all. She profited, yes, but she also feared him as I did. The money in my accounts, much of it came from what we did together, but I had begun returning it, quietly, through anonymous channels, to the families affected. One woman in particular, her name is Sylvia Cresswell, lost everything because of me. I learned recently that she lives in Tillingham Green under another name. She does not know who I am. I wanted to leave my estate to her, to make what small amends I could. But if someone has stopped me, then I trust you to find the truth." Marple folded the letter carefully, her fingers still for a moment. Sylvia Cresswell, living in the village, under another name. She thought of the villagers, the women of a certain age, independent yet reserved, the ones who rarely spoke of the past. She thought of faces behind smiles, of glances a touch too guarded. The next morning, she paid a visit to Ivy Partridge, who was sweeping the tea-shop steps with a distracted air. "Tell me, my dear," Miss Marple said gently, "do you recall Mrs. Halberton ever mentioning where she was from?" Ivy blinked. "The schoolmaster's wife? Oh, well, she's not from here, that's for certain. Bit of a mystery, really. Keeps to herself. Moved here a few years back. I once heard she lived in Manchester before, but she never talks about it." Mrs. Halberton. Quiet, intelligent, always observing. She had come to Tillingham Green with a faint air of sorrow about her and a distinct avoidance of personal history. Later that day, Miss Marple sat with her in the shaded garden behind the Halberton cottage. The roses had not yet bloomed, but the buds trembled on the cusp of opening, just as the truth often did. "I wonder," Miss Marple said after a polite interval of small talk, "if you ever knew a man called Ephraim Cobb."
Under another name.
Mrs. Halberton froze. Her teacup trembled. "Why do you ask that?" "Because he knew you," Miss Marple said, her voice kind. "And because he wanted to help you, in the only way he knew how." For a long moment there was only the sound of birdsong and the distant clatter of a milk cart. Then quietly Mrs. Halberton said, "I was Sylvia Cresswell once. My husband, my first husband, lost everything. A pension fund scheme, Cobb and Lansing. We were ruined. He took his own life. I came here to forget." Miss Marple nodded. Mr. Cobb was trying to make amends, but someone, perhaps Lansing, perhaps someone else, didn't want that to happen. "I didn't kill him," Mrs. Halberton whispered. "I hadn't even spoken to him. I didn't know he was here, not until the recital." Miss Marple believed her. Grief, real and weathered by time, was etched into every word. As she walked back toward the village square, her thoughts circled back to the second version of the will, the one destroyed behind the church. If Mr. Cobb had indeed altered it to name Sylvia Cresswell as his beneficiary, someone else had known. And they had moved quickly to erase that possibility. The question now was simple. Who stood to lose everything if the truth about Mr. Cobb's past and his intended bequest came to light? And how far would they go to keep the darkness unbroken? Miss Marple quickened her step. The wax was softening, and the imprint left behind would soon give away the hand that had pressed it. If one wandered through Tillingham Green in the late afternoon, past the church and its leaning headstones, and down the gravel lane toward the west edge of the village, they would find Ephraim Cobb's candle shop, standing as it always had, shuttered now, but still curiously inviting. There was something almost theatrical about the building, its leaded windows, its carved lintels, and the tall iron sign creaking faintly in the breeze. It gave the distinct impression that its owner might return at any moment, as though death had only borrowed him temporarily. But inside, everything remained untouched, frozen in place, as if the waxy figures in the window had captured time as well as light. Inspector Garraway stood just within the threshold, arms folded, frowning at the faint smell of beeswax that still clung to the air. "Place gives me the creeps," he muttered. "Like a theatre with no audience. Too many shadows." Miss Marple, standing beside him, gave a small nod of agreement. Shadows can be terribly revealing, though. They fall in different places depending on where the light is. He gave her a sidelong glance. "You have something new, don't you?" "I do," she said softly, "though it's not yet fully shaped. More a silhouette than a portrait." They had returned to the cottage to examine the trunk once more. Now that the letter from Mr. Cobb had brought Sylvia Cresswell, now Mrs. Halberton, into the centre of the mystery, the inspector had hoped a second look might turn up another scrap of revelation. But the trunk, beyond the letters and the sealed envelope, offered nothing more. "I still don't understand," he said after a pause. "Why go to the trouble of hiding the truth if Cobb was trying to make things right? What did Lansing have to gain from silence now? The money was being returned. Pride, perhaps," Miss Marple said gently. "Or fear? Or perhaps because it's not only Lansing involved? You see, my dear Inspector, guilt spreads. It infects more than just the original sin." She moved to the workbench, where candles, of varying heights and hues, stood in clusters like silent witnesses. One in particular caught her eye, shorter than the rest, a deep crimson taper burned nearly to the base. She touched it lightly. "He made this the week before his death. Dora mentioned it during tea. He said it was for a reckoning. Odd, don't you think?" Garraway raised an eyebrow. "Poetic, more like." "Possibly. But poets rarely leave bloodied candelabras behind." They left the shop soon after, but Miss Marple took a quiet detour through the churchyard on her way home. The sun was sinking, casting long fingers of gold across the moss-covered stones. She paused by the old iron bench beneath the yew tree and sat for a moment. There was something she was missing, something tucked away in plain sight. Who had truly benefited from Cobb's death? It could not be Elaine Venn. She had returned to the village more out of panic than plotting, and she had been watched closely since. Nor could it be Sylvia Cresswell, Mrs. Halberton, who had neither the motive nor the knowledge that she was
even named in the will. But someone had acted with urgency. Someone had known exactly what Cobb had planned. Someone who had access to his home, his intentions, and perhaps even the documents themselves. The next morning, Miss Marple acted on instinct. She
visited Dora Lacey. Dora received her with a stiff politeness and brought in tea and stale biscuits. Her face was tired, and her hands fidgeted constantly, twisting a lace napkin, then smoothing it, then twisting it again. "You've heard about Mrs. Halberton, I suppose?" Miss Marple said gently. Dora nodded, silent. "She was once Sylvia Cresswell," Miss Marple went on, "a name Mr. Cobb remembered well. He intended to make her his heir." The napkin tore between Dora's fingers. Miss Marple sipped her tea and let the silence grow. "I didn't know," Dora said finally.
"Not until yesterday. The inspector told me." "But you suspected, didn't you?" Dora hesitated. "He spoke of someone he'd wronged. He wouldn't tell me her name. Said it wasn't mine to know."
"And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "he also told you about the will, didn't he?" Dora looked down. "Only that he'd changed it, that he wanted to put things right. I thought maybe he meant me. But then you saw the Shire truth. Perhaps you even saw the letter left out on the writing desk or in his hands. Something that made it clear. And something in you broke." "No!" Dora cried, then caught herself. "No, I didn't kill him. I couldn't." Miss Marple leaned forward. "Then who did?" Dora was trembling now. "I don't know. But I think someone else knew. About the letters, the trunk, about Sylvia. Mr. Cobb wasn't good at locking things up. Not really. His papers were everywhere." Miss Marple nodded slowly. Later that day, Miss Marple made her way to the village library, a modest brick building tucked between the chemist's and the bakery. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and polished pine. She greeted the librarian, Mrs. Berry, with her usual warmth and asked for a few old directories and property records. For the next hour, she studied the records of Cobb's cottage, tracing back through its previous owners, noting names. One entry caught her eye. A solicitor named Reginald Northwood had owned it briefly in the early 40s. That name was familiar. She left the library with the echo of something tickling her memory. Back in her own cottage, she opened her small, wooden box of clippings and correspondence, letters from old cases, notes from friends. And there it was, a letter from a woman in Exeter, dated some 8 years ago, thanking her for advice in a private legal matter. The name at the bottom, Mrs. Judith Northwood. She was no longer in Exeter. She was here. Miss Marple did not knock on Mrs. Finch's door immediately. She waited until dusk when the tea shop was closed and the lights inside glowed low and warm. Judith Finch opened the door with a composed smile, but her eyes betrayed her. "I was just about to have a cup
of tea," she said. "Won't you come in?" Miss Marple did, removing her gloves.
"You knew Sylvia Cresswell," she said, once they were seated. Mrs. Finch's smile didn't falter. "I knew of her." "You were her sister-in-law." A pause, then, "Yes." Miss Marple watched her carefully. "You blamed Cobb for what?"
"Happened to your brother." "Yes," Judith said after a long moment. "I did. I still do. And you knew he intended to make amends." Another pause. I read the letter.
"He'd asked me to witness the will. I refused. Told him he couldn't buy forgiveness." "But you still had access." "I did. And I burned it. I won't deny it, but I didn't kill him." I hated what he did, but I couldn't have struck.
Him down like that. Miss Marple was quiet. But someone did. Judith looked at her.
And you think I know who? Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap. I think you suspect, and I think you're afraid to say, but fear has already done enough harm, don't you agree? A long, fragile silence settled between them. Then, Judith said, barely above a whisper, it wasn't me, but it was someone who had more to lose than I ever did, someone who thought they could control the story. Miss Marple stood. Then it's time we read the story properly, she said, before someone rewrites it in blood again. Outside, the lamps were lit, and the night pressed against the window panes. But inside Miss Marple's mind, the pieces were beginning to fall into place. The wick had burned low. Soon the light would catch. The morning after her quiet conversation with Judith Finch, Miss Marple awoke to the soft patter of rain against her window panes. The weather had turned, as if the sky itself felt the weight of all that was still unsaid in Tillingham Green. The spring had grown colder, damp. She moved with her usual economy through her morning routine: tea, toast, a careful check of the garden, now pockmarked with puddles. But her thoughts were elsewhere, replaying every word Judith had spoken the evening before. She had not confessed to the murder, no, but she had offered something equally valuable: direction. Someone in the village, someone still moving about, freely, had the clearest motive of all, not rage or retribution, but preservation, power, control of a narrative that Cobb had threatened to upend. And so Miss Marple decided it was time to move carefully. She started, as she often did when seeking clarity, with small errands. A stop at the grocer's, a polite conversation about the scarcity of quality butter. A visit to the post office under the guise of sending a note to her nephew Raymond. Along the way, she observed, quietly, attentively, the people of the village, noting who looked her in the eye and who glanced away too quickly. Fear, she knew, wore many disguises. Some people babbled when nervous, others became suspiciously still. At precisely 11 o'clock, she stepped into the candle shop. It had been opened under police supervision that morning to allow for a final inventory. Dora Lacey had been invited to assist, as she had once helped Cobb with his displays during festival seasons. She was there now, dusting shelves and avoiding the space near the dais where the bloodstain had been. Her face was drawn and her voice quiet. "I always liked this place," she murmured when Miss Marple entered. It had a strange sort of peace to it, even with all the shadows. "It still does," Miss Marple said gently, her eyes scanning the room, "though peace has a way of hiding things." Dora looked at her sharply. "You think there's something more to find here?" "I think," Miss Marple said, stepping toward a tall cabinet near the rear, "that Mr. Cobb was a man who prepared for the consequences of his past, and such men often leave behind insurance policies of a sort, hidden messages, reminders, small truths wrapped in silence." She opened the cabinet. Inside were candles, tools, a half-finished ledger, and, tucked between two bound volumes of wax recipes, a slim black notebook. It had no label, no embossing, just a single elastic loop stretched tight around its spine. Dora stood behind her, breath-catching. Miss Marple opened it. Inside were names. Dozens of them, lists, amounts, some with stars beside them, others crossed out, and on one page, written in large, looping hand, a phrase underlined 3 times: "The truth must out, even if I'm gone." Below it, S. Cresswell, entire estate, Miss. Marple closed the notebook carefully and tucked it into her handbag. Dora didn't speak for a long while. Finally, she whispered. "That settles it, doesn't it?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied, her tone calm. "It confirms motive, it confirms intent, but it doesn't name the killer." That afternoon she met with Inspector Garraway again. They sat in the back room of the constable's cottage, the rain now rattling on the windows with more insistence. She placed the notebook between them. Garraway's eyes widened. "Where did you—" "In the candle shop," Miss Marple said mildly, where it had been placed with enough subtlety that only someone who knew what to look for would find
it. He flipped through the pages, grimacing. "This is dynamite. If this had gone public, it still might," Miss Marple said softly.
"Unless the person who killed Mr. Cobb did so to prevent that very outcome," he frowned. "So we're back to Lancing?" "I'm not sure," Miss Marple said. "Cobb wrote letters, remember, and he summoned Elaine Venn. If Lancing was behind the killing, I doubt Cobb would have drawn so much attention to their shared past. No, I believe the killer wasn't part of the scheme, but someone who feared being exposed by it." She leaned back. Someone whose life, position, or authority rested on a foundation Cobb was about to shake. The inspector rubbed his chin. "And you have someone in mind?" "I have a suspicion," Miss Marple said, "but I require one final test." That evening she hosted a gathering. It was a small affair, only 6 guests, each of whom had been close to the events surrounding
Cobb's death.
Dora Lacey, Judith Finch, Reverend and Mrs. Felton, Mrs. Halberton, and Elaine Venn, who had been asked, at Miss Marple's polite insistence, not to leave the village again just yet. They gathered in the drawing-room of Miss Marple's cottage. Seated in a circle with tea and sponge cake served, the fire crackled, the lamplight pooled gently around them, and for a moment it might have been any ordinary evening in Tillingham Green. "I do apologize," Miss Marple began, "for the
oddness of this meeting.
But I believe the time has come to speak openly. Mr. Cobb's death was not a matter of unfortunate chance. It was deliberate, calculated, and, though I loathe to say it, committed by someone in this room." Gasps, of course, a flurry of murmurs. "Now, before you object," she continued, "I must tell you that I have in my possession a complete record of Mr. Cobb's financial dealings. His notebook, his letters, including the one naming his intended heir." She saw the flinch. One person's fingers tensed around their teacup, a flicker in the eye. "Subtle, but not invisible. I also know that Mr. Cobb suspected he would be stopped, which is why he hid the notebook, not in a vault, but in the place he loved best, where truth was melted and reshaped, but never erased." Judith spoke first. "You mean the candle shop?" Miss Marple inclined her head. "Precisely." Reverend Felton, who had been unusually quiet, cleared his throat. "This is all terribly dramatic, Miss Marple, but surely you're not suggesting one of us—" "I am," she said gently. "And I believe the killer revealed themselves when they tried to destroy the second will, a desperate act, and one that left evidence." She reached into her pocket and withdrew a scrap of waxed thread. This was found at the bonfire pit behind the church, caught in the ash. Not from an ordinary candle, but from a ceremonial taper, the kind used in altar settings. Everyone turned slowly to the Reverend. His face had gone pale. "No," he said at once. "No, this is a misunderstanding." "You had access," Miss Marple said softly. "You knew Cobb's intentions. You were the only one in the village he trusted with that draft will. He came to you not for confession, but for witness. He admired you. He thought you would understand redemption." The Reverend's hands were shaking now. His wife sat in stunned silence. "I couldn't let it happen," he said, barely audible. I built everything here, my work, my name. If it came out that I'd once invested in Lansing's fund, just briefly, just for the church. If the public knew, so you silenced him, Miss Marple said. Not out of hatred, but out of fear. He didn't deny it. He only looked down at his hands, as if seeing them clearly for the first time. And in the silence that followed, the fire crackled, and the shadows drew longer on the walls. Miss Marple rose and gently placed a hand on his arm. Confession is not the end of faith, she said quietly. It is the beginning of truth. The truth had caught flame at last, and the wax, so carefully sculpted to conceal the guilt beneath, was melting away. It was not until the next morning that the village learned of Reverend Felton's confession. The news moved swiftly, spreading not as scandal, but as stunned disbelief. Tillingham Green, for all its fondness for gossip, seemed collectively winded by the revelation. The Reverend, so gentle, so solid, so thoroughly good, could not possibly have struck down a man in cold blood. And yet, behind closed doors, whispers turned into mourning. There was a peculiar grief in the air, not for the dead man whose past had proved murkier with each revelation, but for the loss of innocence the village had sustained. Tillingham Green had always believed it was set apart from the world's darker currents. Now it knew better. Miss Marple sat quietly in her parlour that morning, watching the steam rise from her teacup. Her expression was unreadable, her needles at rest in her lap. There was no satisfaction in solving a murder, not really. Only clarity. And sometimes that clarity revealed heartbreak rather than justice. There was a knock at her door. Her housekeeper answered it, and moments later, Inspector Garraway entered, his face grim but not surprised. "He's being held," he said without preamble. "Felton made a full confession just before dawn, said it came to him in the night. Like a sermon he could no longer avoid preaching," Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the motive, as we thought?" "Fear," Garraway confirmed. "Years ago, Felton invested a small church endowment with Charles Lansing's fund, completely above board at the time. But when it collapsed, he managed to cover it up before anyone noticed. Reallocated funds, delayed projects, he's been living with the guilt ever since. And when Cobb began threatening to expose everything, he panicked, the inspector said. Tried to reason with him, but Cobb was adamant, said it was time the truth came out, about everything. Felton tried to talk him down again after the recital, backstage, but it turned into a quarrel. He claims he didn't mean to kill him, reached for the candelabra to make a point, and when Cobb turned away, he struck. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "A single moment," she murmured, "but the weight of it will last a lifetime." Garraway rubbed a hand across his face. "There'll be an inquest, likely prison. Though with his health—" He didn't finish the thought. "What of his wife?" Miss Marple asked. The inspector gave a weary sigh. "She's gone to stay with relatives in Bath, left at dawn, said she needed to breathe." When he had gone, Miss Marple rose and walked to the window. Outside the rain had stopped and the clouds had thinned. A single shaft of sunlight pierced through, glinting off the wet cobblestones like a benediction. She stood in the silence for a long while, before turning back to her desk. There were letters to write. Some offering condolences, others setting records straight. But one, in particular, she placed in a separate envelope and sealed with a deliberate hand. It was addressed to Mrs. Sylvia Halberton, care of the village. Post. Inside she had enclosed a copy of Mr. Cobb's final letter, the one naming Sylvia as the rightful beneficiary of his estate, and a single sentence penned in her own hand. He meant it. In spite of everything, he meant to do right by you. She left the envelope with the postmistress personally. Later that day, she paid a quiet visit to the cemetery behind the church. The groundskeeper was tending to the roses along the boundary wall and nodded respectfully as she passed. She made her way to the newly prepared plot where Mr. Cobb would soon be buried. No headstone yet, just fresh earth and the promise of eventual rest. She stood there a while, her hands folded before her, hat tugged low against the chill wind. "Few people ever truly escape the past," she said softly. "But some try, and that, I think, is worth remembering." Behind her, footsteps approached. It was Dora Lacey, her eyes rimmed with fatigue, but clearer than they had been in days. "I thought I might find you here," she said. "They're saying," the vicar confessed. "That it's all over?" Miss Marple turned, studying her face. "Yes. Though it rarely ever feels over, does it?" Dora shook her head. "I don't know what to do now. The shop's closed. The recital series is finished. Mr. Cobb, he was the reason I stayed in this village." "You can still stay," Miss Marple said gently, "if you want to, but you must find something new to belong to, a reason that's your own." Dora hesitated. "Do you think he was a bad man?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that Mr. Cobb did many things he regretted, but he tried, in the end, to put them right. That's more than some ever manage." Dora nodded and lowered her gaze to the grave. "He liked things that flickered," she said quietly. "Candles, music, shadows. He said they reminded him of people, not always steady, but beautiful in motion." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then perhaps you can carry that forward. Light something that flickers." That evening, as the sun began to dip low over the hills, Miss Marple took her walk through the village. The square was quiet again. Shop shutters were drawn. The pub door hung open, laughter drifting faintly into the street. And yet, beneath the normalcy, something had changed. Mrs. Finch, at the tea shop, now wore an expression of gentler reserve. Judith Finch had not spoken publicly of her involvement. Her destruction of the will remained a private sin, but she had begun, quietly, to place fresh flowers outside the church each morning. No explanation, just colour in the grey. Elaine Venn had returned to Exeter, taking with her whatever secrets she still chose to keep, and Mrs. Sylvia Halberton had visited the solicitor's office in Axminster that very morning. The notebook, Cobb, had hidden the evidence of his financial trail, had been surrendered to authorities in full with Sylvia's permission. Whatever legal proceedings followed, she would not keep the money, but she would use it, she said, to fund a trust, one for those who had been affected by similar schemes. Quiet aid, no names, no newspapers. Miss Marple approved. As darkness fell, lights bloomed gently across the village, warm, golden, steadfast. And in her parlour, Miss Marple lit a single candle, one of Mr. Cobb's last creations. She placed it on the window-sill and sat by its glow, knitting resting in her lap, the flame dancing quietly beside her like a memory. Tillingham Green would return to calm in time. But the shadows that had passed through it would not vanish.
Nor should they. The village had learned something, not just about murder or guilt, but about forgiveness, and about how even a man who had once cast a very long shadow could, in the end, shine a small light. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment, and in the stillness the candle flickered, not in fear,
not in sorrow, but in peace. Though the official case had been closed and the village had begun its slow return to normal rhythms, Something about the matter refused to fully settle for Miss Marple. It wasn't unease, no, the Reverend's confession had held the weary weight of truth. And yet, like a draught whispering through a locked room, there was the sense of something left ajar. The following week brought a series of spring days so fine that even the gloomiest residents were coaxed out of their houses to tend to gardens, sweep their stoops, and pretend, for a little while, that murder had never passed through their lanes. But, to Miss Marple, ever a careful reader of character, the village looked not healed, but suspended, too quiet, too orderly. She took to her walks with purpose now, returning not to investigate, but to observe. The game had changed after all, not a matter of guilt or innocence any more, but of understanding. Why had Ephraim Cobb truly died, and what had he meant to do with the time he was denied? Her answer came, unexpectedly, from the smallest of voices. It was Ivy Partridge, the tea-shop assistant, who stopped her in the lane one breezy morning. She looked pale, with wind-tossed hair, and a glint of unease in her eye. "Miss Marple," she said, dropping a curtsy she rarely bothered with. "I've remembered something odd." Miss Marple, pausing with a gloved hand on her walking stick, gave a faint smile. "Odd things are often rather important, my dear." Ivy fidgeted. "It's about Mr. Cobb. The night of the recital, just before it began, I saw him speaking with someone out back, near the side door of the hall. I didn't think much of it at the time. Someone from the village? No, a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dark coat, hat pulled low, looked older. Mr. Cobb was angry. His hands were waving about. Then he suddenly got very quiet and sent the man away. He didn't come in, though. Slipped back around the side of the building. Could you describe him more clearly?" Ivy shook her head. "Not really. It was getting dark, but I think he was wearing gloves, leather, the shiny sort." Miss Marple gave a slow nod. "Thank you, Ivy, that's most helpful." She continued down the lane at her usual pace, but her mind was alert. This new thread tugged at something old, an itch of doubt behind her calm exterior. The police had been so certain, Reverend Felton had confessed, his motive had been sound, the evidence sufficient. And yet, what if there had been someone else, someone who had come not for reconciliation, but to silence? She turned suddenly and made her way to the constable's cottage. Inspector Garraway, now deep in the drudgery of paperwork, raised a tired eyebrow when she arrived. "You again?" he said, not unkindly. "Don't tell me we missed something. Afraid it's possible," Miss Marple replied, setting her handbag down precisely. "I need to know if any other individuals visited Tillingham Green in the days leading up to Mr. Cobb's death. Anyone not accounted for, not locals, not Elaine."
"Then a man, older, perhaps under a false name." Garraway leaned back.
"We ran a guest list at the inn and checked train arrivals. Only name that stood out was a Mr. Roland Harris, stayed one night at the Hilltop Arms, paid cash, said he was visiting family, no family name given, no follow-up." Did anyone match that name with a face? The inspector frowned. "Just the landlord's wife. Said he was forgettable, which usually means he wasn't." Miss Marple's expression sharpened. "Then I suspect your Mr. Harris may be Charles."
"Lancing." Garraway straightened.
"But we thought Cobb was exposing him, not the other way round. What would Lancing be doing here?" "Making sure," Miss Marple said softly, "that nothing got exposed." The inspector exhaled. If Lancing killed Cobb, then Felton's confession was false. "No," Miss Marple corrected gently. "I think Felton struck him, but Lancing may have finished it." Or perhaps the other way around? 2 blows? Possibly. Or perhaps one was a distraction, a red herring. You see, Inspector, what if the Reverend interrupted a scene already unfolding? Cobb may have already been dying. They exchanged a long look. I'll need to have the coroner's report re-examined, Garraway muttered, standing. Look for signs of an earlier injury, something less visible. Miss Marple nodded. Do look for traces of poison. Mr. Cobb was a man of habits, but even habits can be altered, especially by those with enough reason. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to the candle shop, this time alone. It had not been reopened, and the air inside was still thick with the scent of beeswax and old wood. She moved carefully, reverently, along the workbenches, glancing once more at Cobb's tools, the layers of wax, the ledgers. Then she spotted it, something small, almost invisible, nestled in a drawer beneath the main counter. A corked vial, half full, wrapped in paper, blotched with dark residue. She uncorked it gently and sniffed. Almonds. Bitter and faint but unmistakable. Cyanide. She brought it at once to Garraway. It was enough to demand a second examination of Cobb's remains. Enough to draw a new conclusion. Cobb had, in fact, been poisoned. The blow to the head had not killed him, though it may have hastened his collapse. The real cause was ingested. Deliberate. A murder before the murder. Word spread again through the village, but this time not with shock, with dread. If someone had struck Cobb after he was already dying, that was one kind of crime, but if someone had fed him poison first, then the entire case had taken on a darker sheen. It was Mrs. Halberton who received the news in stunned silence. She sat across from Miss Marple, hands folded tightly in her lap. So, it wasn't the vicar. No, Miss Marple said softly. He was caught in a storm he didn't start. He made a mistake, a terrible one, but the true killer had already acted. Then who? Miss Marple paused. Then, someone who feared not only exposure, but loss. Someone who knew Cobb would not be moved and decided the only way to stop the truth was permanently. Sylvia's gaze narrowed. You're thinking of Elaine. Miss Marple's voice was quiet. Elaine Venn stood to lose everything, not just reputation, but legal immunity. Cobb's letters implicated her. His notebook recorded the schemes. If that became public, her life, her standing, her wealth, it would be gone. Sylvia sat back. She knew he was going to reveal everything. She told me herself he'd written, and so she came, Miss Marple finished, not to plead, but to ensure silence. Inspector Garraway brought her in quietly the next day. Elaine denied everything, at first. But the bottle was found in her travelling case, tucked behind a false lining. The hotel record, the train manifest, the hastily packed valise, all told the story. She had come prepared, and when Cobb wouldn't relent, she had done what desperate people often do, ended the threat. Her confession, when it came, was not tearful. It was cold. He was going to destroy everything, she said, after all these years. After I built a life from the wreckage he helped create, I wasn't going to let him. Miss Marple heard the words, but she listened to the tone. It was not hate. It was fear and control. 2 candles, it turned out, had burned that night. The first flickered out with regret, the second with calculation, but both had been snuffed out in the same breath, and the flame left behind was the one Miss Marple had always tended to, truth. It was nearly a fortnight after Elaine Venn's arrest that peace, tentative and reluctant, began to thread its way back into the corners of Tillingham Green. There had been too many revelations, too much quiet reckoning, for the village to bounce back as if nothing had happened. But as the leaves unfurled on the chestnut trees and swallows returned to the sky, daily life began gently to assert itself. The village clock ticked without hesitation. Curtains were drawn open again, the church bells rang, though their tone was more contemplative now, more fragile. Miss Marple, for her part, did not gloat. She never did. Her satisfaction never came. From being right, it came, if it came at all, from setting things straight. And in this case, even straightness had come at a cost. Ephraim Cobb, for all his secrets, had tried to do something good before the end. That mattered, and so did the truth he died to reveal. She was finishing a letter to Raymond, her nephew, ever eager for news from the countryside, when the doorbell rang. It was a gentle chime, one designed not to startle. Her housekeeper answered it, and, moments later, Dora Lacey stood uncertainly in the hallway, hat in hand, eyes red-rimmed, but determined. "I'm sorry to trouble you," Dora said, "but I thought you ought to have this." She reached into her handbag and withdrew a small, velvet-lined box. Miss Marple took it delicately. Inside, resting on dark satin, lay a candle, a single, slender taper of pale ivory, with a base delicately embossed in silver. It was unmistakably one of Mr. Cobb's final creations. But unlike the others, this one had been engraved at the base in a hand so fine it could easily be missed. "In darkness seek the flicker," Miss Marple read the words aloud. Dora nodded. "I found it in his desk," she said, "tucked beneath the drawer lining. I think he meant it as a sort of message. Maybe not for anyone in particular. Maybe for whoever needed it most." Miss Marple closed the box. "Or perhaps," she said gently, "for everyone." They sat in the parlour, sharing a pot of tea, watching the days stretch out like silk across the garden. Dora seemed lighter now, no longer taut with fear or weighed down by guilt. Her hands still trembled when she spoke of the past, but the tremor no longer came from shame. "I thought I knew him," she said quietly. "Mr. Cobb, but I think I only knew the version of him he allowed me to see." Miss Marple smiled softly. "That is often the case, my dear, but kindness, when offered, sincerely, is no less real for coming from a complicated heart." Later, after Dora had gone, Miss Marple took the candle and placed it upon her mantelpiece. She did not light it, not yet. There would be a time. For now it was enough to know it was there. The following Sunday brought a new vicar to the pulpit, a soft-spoken man from Wells, standing in until the bishop made a permanent appointment. The service was modest and reflective, no grand sermons, no fanfare, just a reading, a hymn, and a brief moment of silence in memory of the recent tragedy in Ditch. The front pew sat Mrs. Halberton, Sylvia, her expression composed, her spine straight. She wore no black, only a simple blue dress, and gloves she did not remove. Judith Finch sat 2 rows behind her, a small bouquet of lilies in her lap. Dora Lacey, at the end of the row, held a hymn book open, though she did not sing. Miss Marple, from her place in the back, observed them all. It struck her how grief lingered differently in each of them. For Sylvia, it was measured and private, no tears, only resilience. For Judith, it was tinged with guilt, a mourning not just for the man, but for the part of herself that had once wanted retribution. And for Dora, perhaps hers was the most complex of all. She had loved Cobb, or something near it, and yet she had feared him, resented him, even envied what he seemed poised to give another. After the service, People lingered in the churchyard, voices hushed, movements careful. There were no harsh judgments now. The village had turned inward, thoughtful. Inspector Garraway stood with Miss Marple near the stone wall where the yew tree cast cool shade. "She'll serve time," he said, meaning Elaine. "The case is solid, the motive clear." "And the means neatly tucked in her handbag," Miss Marple said, with faint irony. He chuckled without humour. "It was the notebook that did it. Cobb wrote everything down. Remarkable, really, how such a meticulous man could have been so careless with it. Or perhaps," Miss Marple said, "he left it out on purpose, a kind of last safeguard. He knew he wouldn't live long. Maybe he knew, too, that someone would come for him." Garraway nodded slowly. "What do you make of it all, then? Cobb? The murder? The mess he left behind?" Miss Marple looked out across the churchyard. "I think," she said slowly, "that Cobb was a man who carried too much. Guilt, ambition, hope, regret. And in the end, he tried to shape something meaningful.
From it all, he used the one skill he had, his craft. Candles, light in the dark."
"He didn't get far," Garraway murmured. "No," she agreed. "But sometimes the smallest light is the one people remember." He looked at her. "And you? Will you remember him?" She smiled gently. "I remember everyone." That afternoon, back in her cottage, Miss Marple finally lit the candle. The wax burned cleanly, without smoke. The flame was steady, unwavering, and cast a soft glow across the walls and bookshelves. She sat beside it with her knitting, the rhythmic motion of needles a quiet metronome to the flickering light. Outside, the village turned golden with the setting sun. Mr. Cobb was gone. The truth had been unearthed. Justice had been served, imperfectly, but earnestly. And life, as it always does, moved forward, tentatively, tenderly. But in one sitting room in Tillingham Green, a candle burned in silence. It did not banish all the shadows. It simply glowed. Several weeks passed, and the village of Tillingham Green, like wax once disturbed, began to settle once more into its quiet shape. There was no forgetting what had transpired, nor should there have been. But there was acceptance. A collective understanding that every community, no matter how quaint or charming, harbours its shadows, and sometimes those shadows take form. Elaine Venn was remanded into custody. Her case, once whispered about behind teacups, had now made the newspapers, though delicately, thanks in part to Inspector Garraway's quiet discretion and Miss Marple's subtle influence. The village was spared the worst of the scandal. Charles Lansing, ever elusive, vanished once again into the fog of legal ambiguity. Whether he would resurface was anyone's guess. The Reverend Felton, whose confession had initially clouded the investigation, was cleared of the most serious charges. Though he had struck Cobb in panic, the coroner's findings had made it clear Ephraim Cobb was dying before the blow ever landed. The Reverend resigned his post quietly and left Tillingham Green with his wife. No farewell service was held. Just a note pinned to the church door. "Forgive as you hope to be forgiven." And as for Mr. Ephraim Cobb himself, he was buried in the western corner of the churchyard beneath a modest stone that bore no titles, no flourishes, only his name, and a single line etched beneath it. "Light, once given, does not forget how to shine." The words had been chosen by Sylvia Halberton. She had declined the inheritance in full. Instead, she worked with the solicitor to turn Cobb's estate into a charitable trust for victims of fraud and financial ruin. A quiet recompense. Anonymous aid. just as Cobb had begun to envision before death found him at last. Miss Marple watched it all unfold with her usual steady grace. She offered no lectures, no speeches, no declarations of triumph. In her world, justice was rarely loud. It was gentle, inevitable, like dawn edging back the dark. She found herself, one golden afternoon, standing before the candle shop. The shutters had been opened now and again. Dora Lacey had decided to keep the business running with Sylvia's support. It had been difficult at first, of course. Some villagers had found the place too heavy with memory, too saturated with tragedy, but others began to return, drawn not just by the scent of beeswax and lavender, but by something else, a kind of
reverence. Dora stepped outside with a soft smile as Miss Marple approached. "I lit one of the red tapers yesterday," she said.
the one he made last. It burned for hours, brighter than the others. I think he would have liked that, Miss Marple nodded. He left behind more than he ever realized. You, for one, the truth, and a shop that still warms the air. Dora looked toward the sky where the sun was just beginning to dip. Do you think he was a good man, in the end? Miss Marple paused, considering. I think he was a man who carried guilt until it became too heavy. And then, when he could no longer run from it, he tried to put it down. Not everyone does. Dora's eyes glistened. Thank you for everything. As the younger woman turned back to her shop, Miss Marple continued her walk, the breeze curling gently around her ankles, her footsteps slow and steady. The village had returned to its rhythms, gardens bloomed, tea was poured, and the postmistress had resumed her minor tyrannies over stamp placement. Life had not forgotten death, but it had allowed it to settle into memory. Back at her cottage, the last rays of light streamed through the windows, setting the mantel aglow. Miss Marple sat in her armchair beside the candle that still stood there, unlit since the day she placed it. She looked at it now, its wax smooth and pale, its wick pristine. The words at its base waited patiently. In darkness, seek the flicker. With delicate fingers, she struck a match and brought it to the wick. The flame took gently. It did not sputter or struggle, it simply lived. And for a moment, in the quiet of that small room, the past and the present shared a soft, golden silence. Another case closed, another light rekindled, and Miss Marple, the most unassuming of detectives, leaned back in her chair, her knitting in her lap, and watched the candle burn, steady, clear, and true.